Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about a neighbor who demands access to my driveway. I've been living in my home for about 7 years now, and until recently, life in this quiet neighborhood was about as close to tranquil as I could ever have wished for. Before moving here, I rented an apartment downtown, surrounded by the constant hum of city streets and late-night traffic. Back then, I dreamed of a place where I could plant my own garden, maybe build a little workshop in the backyard, and just have enough space to breathe. When I finally saved up enough for a down payment, I chose this house because the area was advertised as friendly and welcoming, with a small but supposedly non-intrusive homeowners association. My first few years here went smoothly enough. Sure, the HOA had some rules about trimming hedges and trash can placement, but they never pestered me about anything major. I assumed I'd found the peaceful suburban life I had always longed for. That changed when a new neighbor moved into the house directly across the street. Let's call her Clarabelle. She joined the HOA committee almost immediately upon arrival. According to our neighbor, Jeff, who's the local rumor mill for better or worse, Clarabelle was eager to make her mark. She apparently had a knack for organizing potlucks and rummage sales in her previous neighborhood, so at first, some folks here were excited to have her involved. The initial impression was that she was a go-getter, someone who could put together community events and breathe some new life into the neighborhood. For a short while, I was even hopeful that we might become friendly acquaintances, maybe exchange a few holiday cookies or wave to each other in the morning. That's part of the charm of living in a small suburban community, right? However, it quickly became apparent that Clarabelle had her own vision of how our neighborhood should be run. And that vision involved a very aggressive style of policing everybody's property. She started handing out bright orange violation slips for the smallest perceived infractions: grass an inch too tall, an out-of-season wreath on the door, or a car parked too long on the street. It went from friendly to frightening at the speed of light. I once found 3 different notes pinned under the windshield wipers of my truck, all complaining about some detail or another that I'd never even heard of. When I tried to reach out to her politely, she brushed me off with an air of, "I'm just following the rules, nothing personal," except it sure felt personal. And this was even before the driveway incident, which turned into a full-blown disaster. The thing is, my driveway has a bit of an unusual shape. The house is set back on a slight incline, and the driveway curves around a small cluster of trees. It's somewhat narrow, and it's definitely not a communal driveway. But because my lot lines overlap a strip of land near the main sidewalk, it can sometimes look as if there's a shortcut right across my property. I guess if someone wasn't paying attention to the fence lines or the property survey, they might assume it's partially public land. In reality, it's 100% mine, and the only reason there isn't a large fence blocking it is because, well, I prefer an open layout. I love the aesthetics of the landscaping I've built up over the years, and I've been cautious with my property boundaries since I moved in. My friend Mitchell, a surveyor by trade, helped me confirm that everything was in order before I even made the purchase. So legally, I'm well within my rights to maintain this open style, but apparently, Clarabelle felt otherwise. It started innocently enough with her walking across my driveway one morning to get to the street behind mine. She stepped right through my flower beds, the ones my late grandmother helped me design years ago, and when I gently mentioned that it was actually private property, she shot me a look as if I'd personally insulted her. She sniffed and said something about how the previous owners never minded, which wasn't even true. The folks who lived here before me built the rock border specifically to deter people from cutting through, but I let it slide that day, though it irked me to see her stomping over my carefully planted lavender and marigolds. Not long after that, Clarabelle began complaining about how my curving driveway was an eyesore, how it made the street look unorganized, and how it was confusing for visitors. I told her I had city permits for the driveway when it was first constructed decades ago. The previous owners had all the paperwork, which they passed on to me. She said something to the effect of, "We'll see about that," and walked away with her nose in the air. I thought it was an odd exchange but didn't think much of it at the time. It's not like she could just force me to change my driveway shape, or so I believed. Over the next few weeks, I noticed Clarabelle hanging around with a clipboard in the early mornings, sometimes snapping photos of people's lawns and mailboxes. A neighbor named Ruby said Clarabelle was trying to document rule violations to present them at the next HOA meeting. Now, I'm not the type to go to HOA meetings unless I absolutely have to, but when I heard my name come up as a topic of discussion, I decided to attend. Sure enough, Clarabelle stood up in front of everyone with a slideshow, yes, a literal slideshow, about potential compliance violations. Among them was a picture of my driveway, with big red circles around the edges of the pavement and my flower beds. She started ranting about how it posed a danger to pedestrians. I jumped in, stating that my property line was well defined and that there was no hazard to anyone who didn't decide to trespass. To my relief, most of the committee members seemed to side with me, or at least they weren't convinced by her arguments. The meeting ended with no action against me. I should have been relieved, but something about the whole scenario left me feeling unsettled. I soon learned from Jeff that Clarabelle didn't like to lose. She apparently had a meltdown after the meeting, complaining to anyone who would listen about how uncooperative some residents were. She told another neighbor, Tina, that if the HOA board wouldn't crack down, she'd take matters into her own hands. I dismissed it as empty talk. I mean, what could she realistically do? A few weeks after that, the strangest thing happened. I got a phone call from an unknown number. When I answered, it was Clarabelle, using a tone so sugary sweet it made me suspect something was off. She was requesting permission to use my driveway as a pathway to access the main road so she could avoid some new traffic signals that the city had installed on the main street. She also mentioned wanting to occasionally bring a lawn care service truck through my yard because it would be convenient for them to park on the other side of the fence, which is technically near her backyard. I was stunned. Here was the same person who complained about my driveway existing in the first place. Now she wanted to use it for her own convenience? I politely declined. I told her I was uncomfortable giving blanket permission for her or her service trucks to cross my property whenever they felt like it. I reminded her there were liability issues, and that I simply didn't want random trucks and strangers cutting across my lawn. She tried to insist that I was being unreasonable and that we were neighbors, so we should be doing each other favors. I reiterated my stance. She hung up in a huff, and I hoped that would be the end of it. Of course, it wasn't. One morning, about a month later, I came out to find a large cleaning van parked partially up my driveway, and Clarabelle was directing the driver. She was literally instructing him to drive up the slope to reach her backyard fence. I nearly lost it, but I stayed calm and asked them to remove the vehicle immediately. The driver, who seemed confused about the situation, apologized and backed the van out. Clarabelle glared at me and said, "This is how you treat your neighbors? We're supposed to help each other." I told her to contact the HOA if she had a formal complaint, but in the meantime, she was trespassing. She scoffed and walked away. The next day, I received a letter from the HOA stating that I was obstructing a neighbor's right-of-way. Yes, Clarabelle had actually convinced someone on the board to draft an official warning, though I suspected it wasn't properly voted on. I wrote back immediately, including the property survey, pointing out that my driveway is not a shared easement. It's mine, and I'm not obligated to grant access. The letter from the HOA was eventually retracted with an apology from the board's president, who admitted Clarabelle had tried to push it through without proper review. After that, Clarabelle doubled down on her hostility. She'd stand on the edge of my property with a phone, snapping pictures and grumbling about how my bushes were too close to the sidewalk. Then, she'd complain that my porch light was too bright at night. It was a never-ending stream of petty criticisms. Sometimes I'd catch her walking just on my property line, as though she was measuring something with her eyes. I started to feel uneasy, wondering if I should install security cameras. Several neighbors commiserated, but nobody wanted to confront her directly because, as they said, "It's not worth the drama." Well, drama found me anyway. The final showdown came one sunny Saturday afternoon. I had just returned from the hardware store with some supplies to fix a loose board on my backyard fence. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw Clarabelle's car parked horizontally, blocking the entrance to my property. She was standing there, arms crossed, with a smug expression on her face. I rolled down my window and politely asked her to move. She told me that she'd asked me nicely to let her use the driveway, and since I'd refused, she was going to teach me a lesson. I asked her again to move her vehicle so I could get into my own property. She refused. We went back and forth for a couple of minutes, and I felt my patience slipping. I even offered her one last chance to avoid an unnecessary conflict. Just move the car and go about your day. But she didn't budge. I pulled out my phone and told her that if she didn't move, I'd have to call a tow truck or the police, because she was literally blocking my private driveway. She scoffed at me, whipped out her own phone, and announced that she was calling 911 on me. She claimed that I was threatening her. I actually laughed in disbelief. For a moment, I thought she was bluffing, but she wasn't. I heard her ranting on the phone, telling the dispatcher that I was unlawfully restricting her access to a public street. Meanwhile, I just stood there, feeling a mixture of frustration and amusement, because she was the one who had parked on my property. In a few minutes, 2 police officers arrived. I made sure to stand on my driveway, well away from Clarabelle, so there would be no accusations of me doing anything aggressive. The officers parked by the curb, got out, and Clarabelle rushed up to them, practically shouting about how I refused to let her pass through. She insisted that she had a right to cross my property because it was, in her words, a common driveway. She also claimed I had threatened to damage her car if she didn't move. That was a complete fabrication. The officers, to their credit, calmly asked for both sides of the story. I showed them my ID, pointed out my property lines, and explained the entire situation, including how Clarabelle had parked her car on my driveway without my permission. I even showed them some of the old survey documents on my phone. I'd taken pictures of them, anticipating drama after all the prior run-ins. One of the officers walked over to look at Clarabelle's car, noting that it was indeed well within my private property. When the officers confronted Clarabelle about why she was parked there, she first insisted that the driveway was shared. Then, when they asked her to show any documentation of such an easement, she became defensive and admitted she didn't have any. She said something like, "But everyone knows it's confusing." The officers were unimpressed. They told her that she needed to remove her vehicle or face consequences. She refused, claiming the officers didn't understand the neighborhood's rules. The officers then patiently explained that local and state laws supersede any HOA guidelines and that she was committing trespass by refusing to move. At this point, I saw her face turn red with anger. She started yelling that the officers were biased and that they should be investigating me for intimidation. She flailed her arms around dramatically, refusing to comply when they told her to calm down. One of the officers finally told her that if she continued to resist, she could be placed under arrest. She didn't take that warning seriously. She got right up in the officer's face and demanded his badge number. The officer calmly provided it, but also repeated that she was in violation of the law by refusing to move her car from private property. Clarabelle started ranting about how she pays taxes, how she's on the HOA board, and how she's not going to be treated like a criminal in her own neighborhood. It escalated quickly when she tried to push past the officer, presumably to approach me, though I was standing several feet away just trying to stay out of her immediate path. That's when the second officer stepped in, and to my complete disbelief, they ended up placing Clarabelle in handcuffs right there. She shrieked that she was the one who called 911, so they shouldn't be arresting her. The officers calmly reiterated that she was refusing a lawful order to remove her car, and that she was now being taken into custody for disorderly conduct and trespassing. My other neighbors, drawn by the commotion, gathered on the sidewalks, watching the spectacle unfold with varying degrees of shock. Jeff, who had always been a bit of a fence-sitter regarding the tension between me and Clarabelle, looked absolutely flabbergasted. I just stood there, unsure whether to feel vindicated or mortified. After all, I never wanted it to go this far. The officers had the car towed, and Clarabelle was driven away in the back of a squad car, still shouting that the neighborhood would regret siding with me. In the aftermath of this event, I expected the HOA to come down on me somehow, but surprisingly, they didn't. In fact, the board president arranged an emergency meeting in which they apologized on behalf of the association for Clarabelle's behavior, emphasizing that she was acting on her own. Apparently, they'd already received multiple complaints from other neighbors about her extreme tactics. They told me that while they had no authority over the legal situation, they would be formally removing her from the community watch committee she had been part of. I also received a formal apology letter from the HOA's legal advisor. They confirmed that there was no shared easement on my property and that I was fully within my rights to control who parked or drove on my driveway. They also stated that Clarabelle's earlier letter to me, the one accusing me of blocking a right-of-way, was not authorized and had been retracted. It was a relief to have that in writing. A few weeks later, Clarabelle returned to the neighborhood, much quieter than before. Word around town was that she faced misdemeanor charges, although I wasn't privy to the exact details of her court case. She apparently had to pay a hefty fine, and there was some mandated community service, though I never saw her picking up trash by the highways or anything like that. I didn't particularly care to find out the specifics, so long as she learned that she wasn't above the law. She stopped harassing me altogether. She even took a different route to drive in and out of the neighborhood, which might have been part of a protective order or a condition from the HOA or her legal counsel. I'm not sure, but I was just glad not to see her daily prowling near my driveway anymore. But the story didn't just end with her arrest. There were a few ripple effects in the neighborhood. Some of the neighbors who had been on the fence or had mild sympathy for Clarabelle's complaints now realized just how overboard she'd gone. A couple of them approached me with apologies for not backing me up when the petty complaints started piling up. One neighbor, Patricia, said she wished she'd spoken up sooner, as Clarabelle had been pestering her to get rid of the bird feeder on her front porch, claiming it attracted pests. Another neighbor, Garrett, admitted that Clarabelle had threatened to report him to the city for a noise violation, simply because he had installed a small backyard fountain that made a gentle trickling sound at night. Suffice to say, everyone seemed relieved that her influence on the HOA was significantly diminished. I decided to use this as an opportunity to foster a better sense of community among the rest of us. I pitched the idea of a community open house where people could showcase their gardens, porch decor, or backyard projects in a friendly, non-judgmental way. We'd call it something like a neighborhood summer stroll, inviting folks to walk around and admire each other's landscaping, maybe share gardening tips or homemade lemonade. The HOA board loved the idea. I think they were eager for anything that could help repair their reputation after the Clarabelle fiasco. We planned it for late June. The turnout was actually pretty good, and the atmosphere was relaxed and cheerful, a refreshing change from the tension that had been lingering. During the event, I kept my eyes peeled for Clarabelle, wondering if she might show up to cause trouble or to attempt some sort of apology. She didn't make an appearance. I later heard from Jeff that she was staying mostly indoors, rarely interacting with anyone. Some folks speculated that she might put her house on the market soon, while others thought she was just laying low until the legal dust settled. I had no interest in gossiping about her beyond what was necessary, so I let it go. If she truly wanted to stay, I hoped she'd learned that you can't just run roughshod over your neighbors, demanding special rights to their land. Interestingly, about a month after that event, I got an invitation in my mailbox to a meeting with a mediator. It came from Clarabelle's lawyer, suggesting a sit-down to resolve outstanding disputes amicably. I considered ignoring it, but after talking to a friend who's a retired attorney, I figured it might be worthwhile to at least hear what they had to say. Maybe Clarabelle wanted to offer a formal apology. Maybe she wanted to work out a boundary agreement. Who knew? When I went to the mediation, Clarabelle was there with her lawyer, and I came with the documents showing my property lines. The mediator explained that Clarabelle was seeking a resolution so that both parties can coexist without future conflict. I replied that I had no conflict with Clarabelle, provided she respected my property. She claimed that she needed occasional access to the back section of my fence line for some repairs on her side, apparently because the fences were so close. I told her that if it was a matter of legitimate maintenance that required entering a few feet into my property, she could contact me directly, and I'd be happy to coordinate a time for her or her contractor to do what needed to be done. I just wasn't going to leave my driveway open for her convenience or let her treat it as a public right-of-way. Her lawyer seemed content with that arrangement, and the mediator drafted an informal agreement stating that any future access to my property would require my written permission, arranged in advance. Clarabelle said very little during the session, mostly keeping her eyes on the table and nodding. I couldn't tell if she was remorseful or just forced into compliance by her legal situation. Either way, I had no desire to prolong the tension. I signed the paper and left, hoping this would be the last time we'd have to deal with each other in a legal context. Over the next few months, life returned to normal. I worked on improving my backyard, adding a new greenhouse for my vegetables. I even installed a couple of motion-activated cameras around my driveway, not just because of Clarabelle, but also to have peace of mind in case of any future shenanigans. A few of my neighbors joked that the cameras were a direct result of the Clarabelle Chronicles, as they referred to that bizarre period of neighborhood drama. It felt good to be able to laugh about it with them, though I remained cautious, just in case. One subplot that emerged through all this was an unexpected friendship with the new couple who moved in next door. They'd bought the house previously occupied by an elderly gentleman who moved to a retirement community. The couple, Colton and Addison, were initially wary of the HOA after hearing rumors. When they introduced themselves to me, I gave them the rundown of what had happened with Clarabelle, and they were understandably concerned about living in a neighborhood where someone could be so overbearing. I tried to reassure them that most residents were friendly and that the Clarabelle incident was hopefully a one-time fiasco. Over time, we became good friends. We'd barbecue together, help each other with home improvement projects, and it was nice to have trustworthy neighbors who shared a similar perspective on property rights and boundaries. They understood the concept of respecting each other's space without being unfriendly. In that sense, the entire debacle had at least some positive outcomes. It strengthened my bond with others in the community. Meanwhile, Clarabelle was rarely seen outside. Occasionally, I'd notice her car drive by, but she didn't linger in the common areas. The one time I did see her in person after the mediation, she was briskly walking her dog at the far end of the block. She glanced in my direction and nodded stiffly, then hurried off. I took that as a sign that maybe she was trying to keep her head down and avoid further conflict. That was more than fine by me. I'd be lying if I said there wasn't part of me that felt a measure of satisfaction when she was arrested. Still, the overwhelming feeling I had was relief that the law had been on my side, affirming my right to protect my property. I hadn't wanted things to escalate to that point, but she gave me no choice when she literally blocked my driveway and refused to move. If anything, it was a lesson for everyone in the neighborhood about where the line stands between HOA guidelines and actual legal boundaries. No matter how vocal or powerful someone tries to appear, if they break actual laws, they face real consequences. Even though the drama died down, there remained a lingering curiosity about why Clarabelle was so fixated on my driveway in the first place. One rumor was that she was trying to impress someone on the HOA board by enforcing random rules, hoping to climb the association's hierarchy. Another rumor suggested she thought that by forcing me to concede driveway access, she could add some kind of shortcut or private entrance to her own property, increasing its market value. To this day, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it was just a combination of entitlement and the thrill of exerting control. A few of the older residents in the neighborhood told me they'd seen similar HOA bullies come and go. One elderly neighbor, Agnes, recounted a story from 15 years ago involving a different resident who tried to fine people for having certain types of garden decorations. That resident also tried to manipulate the HOA board for their personal agenda, but eventually, the community rallied against them, and they either left or gave up. The lesson, I suppose, is that while HOAs can be useful for maintaining neighborhood standards, they can also attract individuals who crave power in small but disruptive ways. Staying informed of your rights is the best defense against that sort of behavior. In the months that followed, the board implemented clearer guidelines for addressing complaints. They introduced a policy that any reported violation must be accompanied by photographic proof and must clearly reference an existing bylaw. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step in the right direction, ensuring that no single person could hijack the process for personal vendettas. The board also made it a point to distribute property boundary maps to all homeowners, encouraging them to understand their lots and respect their neighbors' spaces. It was a practical measure that might prevent someone like Clarabelle from ever claiming, "I didn't know that was private property," again. On a personal level, the experience taught me the importance of calmly documenting everything. From the moment Clarabelle started acting out of line, I took notes, kept copies of every letter, and saved every email. When it came time to show the police and later the mediator, I had a solid record of events. Without that, it could have turned into a he said, she said scenario, which would have been much harder to navigate. So if there's one piece of advice I'd pass on, it's to always document interactions if you sense the slightest whiff of conflict. The day after Clarabelle's arrest, I had to go down to the station to give my statement. I was fairly nervous, never having been directly involved in a case that led to someone's arrest before. But the officer who took my statement was the same one who had responded to the 911 call. He assured me I had nothing to worry about. He said that Clarabelle had been uncooperative and combative, and that her behavior left them little choice. We talked briefly about the possibility of a restraining order, but since Clarabelle had not threatened me with violence, beyond shouting baseless accusations, the officer recommended we try mediation first. That's how we ended up with that mediator session a few weeks later. I was also concerned about potential retaliation. However, the officer said Clarabelle would likely be on her best behavior once she realized how easily her actions could land her in more trouble. He was right. Besides that short moment when I saw her walking her dog, Clarabelle never tried to confront me again. I continued to live my life, focusing on my home projects, work, and enjoying the neighborhood events that continued throughout the summer and into the fall. One autumn afternoon, I got an email from the HOA board inviting me to give feedback on the new processes they were developing, like a refined version of the complaint policy and a code of conduct for board members and volunteers. They wanted to ensure that no single person would ever again have the kind of unchecked power Clarabelle had briefly wielded. I appreciated the effort, though I was a bit reluctant to get too involved in HOA matters. Still, I provided some suggestions, mostly concerning the importance of transparency and the need for a clear appeals process. The board was surprisingly open to my input. Over time, the story of how Clarabelle got arrested in my driveway became almost like a neighborhood legend. A cautionary tale passed around during backyard cookouts. Remember that time the new HOA lady called the cops on him, only to get arrested herself? Each time it was told, it served as a reminder that a homeowner does have rights, and no amount of HOA intimidation can override the law. People seemed to take note, and I think it contributed to a more relaxed, respectful atmosphere overall. We had fewer petty complaints and more actual conversations about how to keep the neighborhood looking nice without stepping on each other's toes. Meanwhile, I continued investing in small upgrades. I fixed that loose fence board and repainted the fence entirely. I added pavers to the side yard, creating a neat walkway to my backyard workshop. I also expanded my garden, planting some new rose bushes and a small herb patch. Being able to do so without worry about Clarabelle's meddling was a relief. It was a victory not just for me, but for the principle that people should be allowed to enjoy their own property in peace. One day, I ran into the HOA president at the grocery store. She thanked me for my patience, acknowledging that they should have stepped in earlier when Clarabelle started making those baseless complaints. I told her I understood that HOAs sometimes struggle with volunteers who overstep boundaries. She agreed, saying they were working on better onboarding for anyone who wanted to join the board or a committee, emphasizing guidelines, ethics, and the limits of their authority. While I'm typically cautious about praising HOAs too much, I had to admit that ours was learning from this incident. Sometimes it takes a crisis to catalyze real change. Friends, thank you. See you soon.